Well, good morning or good night to those of you that are online. Whatever time of day, we want to go ahead and welcome you to the Singapore Bible College's Symposium on Honor and Shame and Contextualization. This is on behalf of the college, but also the Helix Research Center and the School of Theology English. We also want to thank the Templeton Fund through a subgrant from Dr. David Wong of Fuller Theological Seminary, which has provided us with an opportunity by which to be able to bring so many theologians and scholars from around the world to dialogue together. So we look forward to a very, very rich time of sharing, not only in the morning, but also we have sessions in the afternoon where these 10 theologians and scholars will be coming together to discuss issues of contextualization, honor, and shame. I don't know whether, for those of you here, I don't know whether you can show this, but if we could have our guests to rise, the speakers for the next 3 days to rise, we'll welcome them. So, yes, thank you. Good. Thank you. All right. So you might ask is that why is it that we are having this conference? And it really because of two things. First of all, last year, Bishop Hua Young, during the Asia Congress 2022, he said that we really need to try to develop a contextualization work group. And I'll let him share later on as to his vision and his passion for why we are doing this. The impetus was from Claire Chong from the Singapore Center for Global Missions, and she asked this question: is it possible for us to do contextualization without Paul Hebert's critical contextualization? And that got me thinking: is it really possible? What are the basic elements of contextualization? And what might it look like in an Asian context? So these are some of the issues that we're going to be discussing over the next 3 days, and we're going to be using honor-shame as a case study to try to understand how contextualization relates to honor and shame. So tomorrow we have Dr. Chris Flanders, who has been a longtime missionary to Thailand, and wrote one of the seminal works on Thai faith. So he'll be sharing along with Dr. Jerry Huang, who will be zooming in from Chicago on Old Testament understanding of honor, shame, and then also Dr. Neri Santos from Tyndale in Toronto, who will be sharing from a New Testament perspective. And then we'll have a variety of case studies on Wednesday. So that is what is going to look like. It should be a very fruitful discussion. We also will let you know that afterwards, you are welcome to join us for lunch. Today, we don't have a whole lot of students, so if you want to fellowship with the speakers and so forth, it'll be in the canteen in Oasis, and it'll give you an opportunity to ask, to fellowship with them and ask questions and grill them, whatever. But I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to Bishop Hua Young, and he'll give us an opening prayer and also share with us his passion for why this is such an important topic for Asia. So let's welcome Bishop Hua Young.
First, good morning or good evening or good night, friends, from wherever you are. First, I want to thank Dr. Sam Law for his kind invitation for us to come here. and we trust that our time here would be a good time of meeting and good discussions, fruitful discussions. Let me begin with prayer and then, excuse me, I got a lifelong problems with my sinuses, and there's no infection, don't worry, okay? Certainly no COVID. Don't worry, it's okay. Thank you, Sam. Let's pray together, friends. I will begin by reading a short passage from Psalm 36. How precious is your love, O God! The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light. Lord, we thank you that you give to us this opportunity to meet in this way. We thank you for providing the finances and resources and the people to come to discuss this issue. Lord, as the psalmist said, in your light do we see light. And Lord, we do need to see light because within Asia, as well as in other parts of the majority world, we want to be able to help our people see your light. But sometimes the light is given in different shades, and it doesn't help our people to see it. So we want to pause and ask for your presence here, so that as we discuss this issue of contextualization, we'll be able to help the people wherever we are throughout the world to see your light in its true colors, to fully understand your truth. So we come to wait upon you. Please bless our meeting. Please guide us in our discussion. Please keep us conscious of your presence. And grant that the discussion will be fruitful as we help the church to move forward to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Friends, I've been asked by Dr. Sam Low to give a brief introduction on the whole theme of contextualization, something which has been in my blood for many years. I understand the theme for this consultation is, as we all know, contextual issues of honor and shame in spiritual formation. The main concern, as I understand, is also about contextualization of the Christian faith and theology, with a particular focus on the question of honor and shame in spiritual formation. Allow me to briefly share my own journey about why I came to the point where I came to. I went off to study theology in my late 20s, went to Trinity College in Bristol. It was a place at that time where the Anglican, some of the most well-known Anglican luminaries in the theological world were gathered. J.I. Packer was there, Colin Brown was there, Alec Mottier, one of the editors of the Old New Bible Commentary, was there, Joyce Bowen, who wrote a couple of superb commentaries in the Tyndale Old Testament series, was there. So I went there wanting to learn theology. Then I found myself struggling with certain issues, and in fact, I went into depression, partly because of those issues. But there were two significant experiences I had, partly in my time of study, also but partly subsequently. First was one of the professors teaching philosophy of religion and systematic theology. He was talking about the book of Daniel, and somebody asked him about how could Daniel's three friends walk into the furnace and not be burned. And as a good committed evangelical, he sort of gave a rather rationalistic Western explanation. He said, probably what happened was that the king was so angry, he got the furnace to really got it hot. And as the guards took the three friends to the furnace, there must have been some sort of explosion, the guards were killed, and the three friends survived, and the story comes down to us in the story of Daniel in that way. I was scratching my head. I said, oh, is that so? Then I say, Dr. So-and-so, in my country, I say, we go to the Hindu temples and the Chinese temples. During festivals, they actually walk on fire. He looked at me and says, I've never seen that. I've got no comments to make. So I scratched my head again. I went away. I say, I can learn a lot of very good Western theology, evangelical Western theology from this man, but I would not be able to learn much to minister in my own culture. That was one of my first struggles. My second struggle was, some of you know that I'm very much into missiology. And I just couldn't understand the big debate between the conservatives and the liberals, whether you do evangelism first or you do social concern first. And some of you will remember those debates were very common about 40, 50 years ago, especially among young people. And as I thought about it, the same seemed strange. My father brought us up in the very strict Confucian culture. And he made us study the Confucian 4 books, memorized by heart when we were young. And I was the worst in the family. I got scolded or got punished for not being able to memorize those classics. Those of you who come from a Chinese background will know what I'm talking about. Now, in our Confucian classics, there's a classic passage which says, you want to change the world, you begin with knowledge. With knowledge, self-cultivation, personal transformation, family transformation, you take care of your community, then you can go and conquer the world. Now, in other words, the personal and the spiritual and the inner dimension and the external dimension of the external world were not separable. The two are all interlinked. It's a holistic view of life. You can't talk about whether you do evangelism first or social concern first. And time come, I realized that the problem was Western philosophy has bought deep into Greek dualism. Soul and the body. So which is more important? Is the soul more important or the body more important? Now, those of you who know evangelical discussions now will realize that increasingly now, we are leaving that discussion behind. We are moving towards holistic mission. We proclaim the gospel wherever the human needs are, but we want to point them to God. But that's another discussion altogether. So as I pointed out, as I noted, there was a time. So these 2 experiences was what among a number of others, which forced me to go back and wrestle with what is the theology that's relevant to me as I preach and proclaim the gospel and do theology in the context of Asia. There was a time, as all of us know, that when evangelicals and the more conservative Christians thought that contextualization is primarily a liberal agenda. Those of you who live as old as me will remember that in the 70s and 80s, that was the theme. It's liberals who do it. A liberal agenda by which the gospel becomes distorted to suit the fancies of contemporary culture and intellectual fashions. That there is some truth in this perception, no one would deny. You think about Bookman's demythologization in the West, or you think of, in Asia, the writings of Asian writers like Kosuke Komayama, C.S. Chong, or Stanley Samata from Japan, Taiwan, India, respectively. But it would be fair to say that in the past 30, 40 years, within a non-Western or majority world, evangelicals have gradually come to realize 2 things. On the positive side, they realize that the effective communication of the gospel requires serious contextualization. This is clearly seen in the fact that the main driving force in the rapid growth of the church in the majority world in the past 100 years has been the signs and wonders of the Holy Spirit. That has been, you cannot run away from that. That's a fact, historically documented. Western missionaries with theology shaped often by the anti-supernaturalism of the Enlightenment were generally weak and slow in their understanding of this whole realm. But indigenous Christians in Africa, Asia, and Latin America began reading the Bible for themselves and in simple faith just trusted God to do His work through the Holy Spirit. And the churches grew because the gospel was contextualized to speak with power to the spiritual hungry and enable the church to do exorcisms, healings, signs and wonders, etc. That's for the positive side. Negatively, it's now slowly but gradually recognized by Western scholars themselves that Western theology itself is largely shaped by the particulars of their own history, their culture, and intellectual thought, out of which these theologies came. That's exactly what, for example, the late Andrew was, probably the doyen of evangelical mission thinkers in the past generation. What Andrew Walls exerts in his writings, that much of Western theology actually is narrowly contextual to its own history and culture. Many examples of this can be given. I gave the example of Bookman's demythologization program. It was narrowly contextual within a European context. Or the dualistic mission theology I just mentioned, which is rooted in Greek dualism. We can go and give other examples as well. So we can come to the theme of contextualization. What then is contextualization? I'll not try to bore you with an academic definition here. That belongs to a PhD thesis. But the concerns here are primarily twofold. The first concern is to express the truth of the gospel and to proclaim it clearly and adequately as it has been revealed to us in Christ and in the text of the Bible. We need to be able to express that truth clearly and adequately. The second is to express and proclaim that truth in such a manner that the hearers can understand the message clearly and have their felt needs, a term that's used by missionaries, the felt needs met, that the gospel are meeting the needs that they know. But the question is, why then do we bother about contextualization? And I'll give 3 answers briefly this morning. The first, the hope of contextualization is based on the incarnation. Contextualization is rooted in the gospel itself. In John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Finite beings like you and me cannot grasp infinity. For an infinite God to make himself known to us, he has to express himself in terms that we can grasp and understand. And that in itself is contextualization. Otherwise, what else do you call it? In other words, contextualization is rooted in the very nature of the gospel, in the coming of Christ incarnate. As Andrew Walls describes it, he uses the word indigenization, which essentially means the same. He explains the indigenization principle as follows. The desire to indigenize, to live as a Christian, and yet as a member of one's own society, to make the church a place to feel at home. The desire to do this is tied up with the very nature of the gospel. It is patterned in the incarnation itself. When God became man, Christ took flesh in a particular family, members of a particular nation, with the tradition of customs associated with that nation. All that is not evil, he sanctified. Wherever he is taken by man in any time and place, he takes that nationality, that society, that culture, and sanctifies all that is capable of sanctification by his presence. No group of Christians has therefore any right to impose in the name of Christ upon another group of Christians a set of assumptions about life determined by another time, another place. So first point I want to make is contextualization is rooted in the very God nature of the gospel itself, in the incarnation. Secondly, contextualization is found repeatedly throughout the Bible. And oftentimes, we read it without realizing it. One of the best places that explains this is, for those of you who want to explore this further as an introduction, read Michael Green's book written 50 years ago, Evangelism in the Early Church. Chapter 5, where it talks about evangelization in the Gentiles. You can find most libraries, in the seminary libraries. Chapter 5, evangelization in the Gentiles. And that explores how the apostles took the gospel and contextualized it in a way out of Hebrew culture into Greco-Roman culture. They did it in order to help the listeners to understand the gospel. Many examples can be given. The best is found in the prologue of John's gospel, which all of us know. In the beginning was the Word, or Logos. And the Word, or Logos, was God. And the Word, or Logos, was with God, and the Word of Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. John took a term that the whole Greco-Roman were understood, at least among those who are educated. A word that can mean reason, A man word can mean semi-divine being. He took that word and communicated it, but he was very careful. He said, in the beginning was the word, Logos. He was with God, but not in a Greek sense, a semi-God, but he was himself God. Clearly defined it, and that was contextualization at its best. Using a term that people can understand, and yet defining it in such a way that there will be no misunderstanding. The early church fathers took it further in their writings. Michael Green comments as follows. When Justin Martyr and his successors were concerned, what Justin Martyr and his successors were concerned to do was to take this term of wide and varied usage and use it as a vehicle for Christian truth, which will enable him to claim as Christian all that was good or noble in pagan philosophy, to maintain that Christianity is as old as creation, and to explain the relationship of creation to redemption. Though an operation of this sort was a perilous undertaking, which could and did lead to all manner of misunderstanding, it was an absolutely necessary undertaking if the intellectuals could hear in terms what they really admitted. In other words, if the intellectuals in the Greco and Roman culture were to understand the gospel, Justin Martyr and others had to use the term Logos in order to help them understand it. So that's the second point. Contextualization is actually found in the Bible and used by the early church. The third one probably is surprising. I want to suggest that Bible translation is the reason why we must do contextualization. You know, I mentioned that evangelicals earlier had resisted the idea of contextualization. Actually, what most of them did not realize was that they were actually contradicting themselves when they rejected it. When we look at the propagation of the gospel, one of the most important part of the process that went side by side with the advance of the gospel was that there was Bible translation. And who were the main Bible translators in the 20th century? It was the evangelicals. And you cannot do Bible translation without contextualization. Think about the struggles that the missionaries had trying to translate a word into Chinese, right? Do you use the word Tao, or what word do you use? Or think about the words that Greeks, Koreans had struggles about translating the word for God in Korean. There was a lot of debate on that. They were trying to find words that could communicate. And the very struggle of that is contextualization. You cannot do Bible translation without contextualization. So summing up, one, contextualization is an absolute necessity in the proclamation of the gospel, in the translation of the Bible, and the formulation of theology. We cannot run away from that, especially those of us from the non-Western context. Otherwise, we'll always be preaching a foreign or Western gospel which does not cut eyes in our own context. Secondly, we must remember that this is always a process that involves many hazards along the way. Thus, every precaution must be taken when we deal with this subject. We want to ensure that our listeners understand the gospel brought to them, and that it is powerful in addressing their felt needs. At the same time, we want to ensure that in doing it, we will always be faithful to God's truth in the Bible. May God grant, as we meet together, His presence with us, so that we have the grace, humility on the one hand, and boldness on the other to move forward. Thank you.
Hua Yong, you actually have some extra time, so that means I can ask you some questions. Yes, so thank you so much for being on time. Maybe to go a little bit further, if I could also ask the question is that, do you feel that Asian church leaders and scholars also have the same framework? Because you had shared that I think the Western missiologists are recognizing that there is a need for contextualization, even evangelical missiologists. But in Asia, is the perspective ready to be able to contextualize? Because the reason I ask is in the OMF theological consultation last year, they shared that oftentimes many church leaders, they equated what was taught by the missionaries as absolute truth and wouldn't even question or contextualize.
You're asking me in the context of Singapore, the most westernized city in Asia. And so you know what my answer would be like. And I know people like Claire would laugh because they know my comments. I think this is a difficult challenge for us. I think most Asian leaders have not struggled with that, to be honest. And I'm glad that I was very pleased to meet Sam, Dr. Sam Law last year when I could see that he was actually doing the work, and when he and Dr. Kiam Kok wrote the book and asked me to look at it, I saw, hey, this is excellent work, you know. I was very pleased to see that there was a group of people that was wrestling with this issue. I think the main problem was, at least I'm speaking as somebody in my 70s, when I was growing up, the Western culture was overwhelming as I was growing up. The films were West, the church was Western, the worldview was Western. Everybody was focusing in Malaysia, was focusing on your studies in English, but at least now in Singapore, they talk about English and Chinese or English and mother tongue. But that time, everything was English. The Western paradigm was so overwhelming that people just saw the West as dominating. So Christianity then was also seen in very Western terms. But only, unfortunately, some missiologists and church leaders are moving away from that paradigm. The church sometimes is a bit slow, but I'm glad that this is happening here, and I pray that we'll be able to push and encourage others to explore that much, much more. I want to say one thing in further response. Those of us who recognize what's happening in the West, they realize that Western Christianity is struggling. It's not just the liberal circles, but it's also evangelical circles that struggles. And I think increasingly, the challenge is for those of us in the majority world, Asia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America, where God has so blessed us so richly in the last 100 years with such immense growth, we now need to be able to dare to have the confidence to take leadership in some of these issues. I hope that answers your questions.
Yes. Thank you very much. And we'll have more time to dialogue afterwards. Thank you. I'm going to stick here. So our next speaker is Dr. Justin Lee, who is Associate Professor in Systematic Theology. He's going to continue the story to help us to understand where contextualization has been or is in the progress at this present time. So we'll turn the time over to Dr. Justin.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sam. Good morning or good afternoon from wherever you are, those who are here on site and those who are online. Very happy and thankful and honored to be able to present today, especially after Bishop Hua Young, whose work I definitely admire very much. Just a quick warning, I do have a bit of a cough, so if I end up just coughing a bit, please bear with me, but I'm recovering from a sort of a cold. Okay, so let's begin this paper. The topic and title of this paper is Contextualization, Current State in Southeast Asia. The paper is in large part a critique of contextualization as many of us understand it, so it's a bit ironic that this paper and even our sessions today we'll be critiquing contextualization, and we're not talking at all about honor or shame, so I apologize for that in advance. Now, I'm not saying today that contextualization is not important or not necessary in mission or theology. I think it goes without saying here, especially amongst a group like this, that contextualization is an important, if not essential, task of the church, as well as that all theology is in fact contextual. What I'm doing here is, from my own personal background, I am not in missiology, although I have been interested in and reading a lot of missiological texts for a long time. I'm actually a historical theologian who works in patristics, but I think that in terms of turning the skills that I've gained over the years onto a different area leads to new sets of questions and approaches and perspectives that maybe will highlight things that many of us maybe haven't thought about as well as we could have. So this paper will examine and critique some of the unaddressed assumptions that govern much of what is understood as contextualization. In doing so, it will paint a picture of the process of contextualization as muddier and more complex than we might realize, bringing to light the many complex factors and processes that accompany the sharing of the gospel between cultures or in the formation of new theological paradigms and systems, that is, in doing theology. But I hope that it will create new topics for conversation and help us all to be a bit more honest and thorough in how we approach this topic. So I will be talking about two major points. There's two major sections in this paper. The first is that there is a need for more self-knowledge in contextualization. And number two, there's a need for a more historical awareness of the process of contextualization. So the first section, which I've titled Contextualization Between Cultures. Contextualization, according to Dean Fleming, is the dynamic and comprehensive process by which the gospel is incarnated within a concrete historical or cultural situation. Effective contextualization requires not only deep knowledge of the culture into which one is contextualizing, but also awareness of one's own culture and how that culture shapes one's own faith and theology. However, this particular aspect of contextualization, knowledge of one's own cultural and even theological situatedness, continues to be underemphasized. In many evangelical circles, contextualization really only involves the culture into which the gospel is being preached, the worldview, values, and concerns of that culture, and how to speak gospel truth into such situations. There is often an underlying assumption that the gospel that is transmitted is universal without culture or context. I'm not denying here that the gospel itself transcends culture, but the form the gospel takes is always shaped by culture. The transmission of the gospel is always from one cultural form into another. As Jerry Huang, one of our former faculty members, comments, the main obstacles in contextualizing the gospel, in other words, have not usually been in repackaging the gospel intelligently for them. For Bible-believing Christians to assume that the task mainly involves translating the essence of Christian truth into local expressions, as in the usual dichotomy between Scripture's message and cultural methods, risks becoming the sort of imperialism that assumes that we have faith and truth while they have interpretation and culture. This is seen, for example, in the continued use of incarnational language in many missiological circles, maybe in a previous generation, which is, of course, an important biblical and theological theme, but when used uncritically can be dangerous in assuming one's perspectives are universal and acultural. One area in which this is most obvious, this limitation is most obvious, is in the language of syncretism. A. Scott Moreau defines syncretism as, and I quote, the replacement or dilution of the essential truth of the gospel through the incorporation of non-Christian elements, end quote. While others hold to more neutral definitions of syncretism, evangelicals have shown a particular concern for protecting against syncretism due to strong Bible-centeredness and emphasis on particular hermeneutical methods. While syncretism is a real and present danger, in reality, the boundary between contextualization and syncretism is quite blurry. When we add to this the shifting nature of culture and drawing boundaries becomes even more difficult. But who defines what syncretism is? As Gary Corwin has comically observed, what's the rule of thumb definition for the definition between contextualization and syncretism? Simple. It's contextualization when I do it, but syncretism when you do it. For the most part, Western missionaries and theologians have determined for the rest of the world the standard for what syncretism is. But there are clear problems with this. One major issue is that the label of syncretism has often been used as a means for those in control, typically Western missionaries, to maintain power over others using the label when they feel threatened. In fact, one of the primary ways in which syncretism is used is as a pejorative against developments in non-Western churches that do not align with Western Christian tradition, even assuming that such challenges or developments are heretical or sub-Christian. Just a quick comment. We just had the APEX, Asia Pacific Early Christian Studies Society Conference this past week at Trinity Theological College, and there was a very interesting lecture by a Chinese lecturer who's based in Austria and Cambridge, named Li Tang, about Syriac Christianity. And one of the very interesting things about Syriac Christianity is how syncretistic it looks in a lot of ways. If you ever go visit the Asian Civilizations Museum, you'll find a series of crosses on the walls with the Buddhist, I don't know the form, but the swastika-looking thing in the cross. And you say, is that syncretism? Maybe. We'll get back to that. So, Heidemann comments, in this mission context, therefore, syncretism and contextualization are words which European and North American Christians use to judge what response they should make to what is happening in Asia, Africa, or among indigenous peoples. They seldom use the words to apply to their own context. They can easily be heard as power words, enabling those who use them to maintain benevolent theological control on behalf of Orthodox Christian truth, making sure that the younger Christians do not fall into the errors which were once made in the West. It is therefore not surprising that Christians from Asia and Africa often react negatively to Western discussions about syncretism. Underlying this is the assumption that Christianity is a finished product and that syncretism is only really an issue outside of the West, for example, in the majority world mission fields. But considering such aspects of syncretism gives rise to further issues. The first is that syncretism is a problem not only in the global South, but also in Western churches. As I have noted above, all faith is culture-bound and will naturally be shaped by culture. The relationship between gospel and culture is complex and multidimensional. To be unaware, then, of how culture actually shapes faith can often be a greater danger than the traditional syncretism, especially if one does not believe this about themselves, that is, that their faith is shaped by culture as well. As Moreau comments, ultimately, evangelicals recognize that we must acknowledge that every church is in some sense syncretistic. The reality of sin, the dangers of cultural idolatry, and the fact that none of us has a complete grasp on truth are so much a part of our lives that syncretism is in some sense inevitable. In some sense, every religion draws from its surrounding culture, which makes all religion syncretistic to some extent. Again, that's a bit more of a social scientific definition. But for the discussion on syncretism to move forward, one important shift that needs to take place is that evangelicalism, especially American evangelicalism, which is where I come from, or white American evangelicalism, needs to recognize and admit too that its theology is oftentimes contextual or even syncretistic. Recently, however, with the decline of the American evangelical church, there has been a growing sense of how culture has in fact become theology for much of American evangelicalism, highlighted by strong evangelical support for Donald Trump in the 2016 and 2020 elections. For example, there has been a slew of books in the past couple of years highlighting this, and here are some examples of these. Books on race, for example, Reading While Black by Esau McCauley, Jamar Tisby's The Color of Compromise, both came out in 2020. Books on femininity and masculinity, or on American evangelical identity, like Kristen Kobus-Dumet's Jesus and John Wayne, or Beth Allison Barr's The Making of Biblical Womanhood. A book in 2019 by Charles and Raw called Unsettling Truths about the Doctrine of Discovery in the West. Or even in this year, these are all from this year, David Hummel's The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism, Caitlin Sheese, The Ballot Box in the Bible, and I forget what else I put there. The Evangelical Imagination by Karen Swallow Prior and others. These books are all demonstrating this idea. So whether race, gender, capitalism, politics, etc., scholars now are exposing to the world the embedded cultural beliefs of evangelical American theology that have been assumed by many to be theology instead of culture. Might such studies actually be understood then as studies about American syncretism? We've never thought about that before, right? Now, the second issue concerning syncretism is that many typically Western missionaries are unaware that they themselves may actually be a source of syncretism. If a missionary preaches the gospel or contextualizes without proper critical awareness of their own cultural situatedness, they may simply be repeating the same problem, propagating a particular contextually based understanding of the gospel that may itself actually be syncretistic. As Hesselgrave and Raman warn, perception of the communicator's own cultural heritage as an integral element of the gospel is one of the two major pitfalls that missionaries avoid, the others being, of course, syncretism. Now, this issue is a particularly relevant one for the Asian church. For much of the Asian church, Christianity continues to look like and is perceived to be a Western religion despite its long history here in this region. Many local leaders and even theologians do not know how to theologize for themselves, simply repeating tired, old theological debates of the past. For example, predestination continues to be a source of debate in this part of the world. As Bishop Hua-Yung mentioned, this idea about not being aware of this contextual necessity. And as Jerry Huang, again, comments, the fact remains that the boundary between contextualization and syncretism is one that Asian Christians often feel ill-qualified and hesitant to draw. This is owing both to a centuries-long habit of deferring to Western missionaries as their theological authority, as well as the entrenched presuppositions held by Western and Asian evangelicals alike, which regard the use of Asian cultural traditions in doing theology as a modification of the gospel itself. So, while protecting younger churches from the danger of syncretism is important, might the bigger problem these days be that many evangelicals in the Asian context, are actually unafraid or unwilling to contextualize and thus do not go far enough in engaging culture in a real way? Is it not true that for real and effect contextualization to take place, there must be the danger of syncretism? Otherwise, reverse syncretism, that is, Western syncretism, will inevitably follow. Might one reason for this be because of Western missionaries who are or have been afraid of losing control or power, or local believers unwilling to deviate from standards set for them by foreigners in a very oftentimes patriarchal way? And it's not one possible reason for the lack of the growth of the church in Asia, not that it's not growing, but lack of the church growth compared to, say, Africa or Latin America, or its lack of ability to self-theologize be because of this very point. So, how then do we draw the boundaries for syncretism? Now, I'm sure people here want me to give a clear answer, and there isn't time for that today. The Bible is central, of course. Tradition plays a very important role. But this is the question. Do tradition and scripture necessarily have to be mediated through the Western church, that is, through Western missionaries and theologians as its guardians? Dialogue is important, especially global dialogue, and as Morrow argues, we need to develop, to quote, develop trust so that we all work as a community in order to overcome the too quick application of negative labels, end quote. And so I've developed this a bit more elsewhere, but you can ask me about this later if you're interested. So the second section, which I've titled Contextualization in History. This leads to my second point. Contextualization is not only a theoretical task, but includes efforts past and present, the theoretical other, but also ourselves. Returning to Dean Fleming, any adequate understanding of contextualization should not simply prescribe what should be done as if we were initiating something new. It should also describe what has been and is being done, recognizing that it has to do with something that has been ingrained in the Christian mission throughout the ages. This particular aspect of contextualization, how it has taken place in history, continues to be an understudied and underemphasized aspect of contextualization. Many of the standards in the study of contextualization, for example, Bevans's Models of Contextual Theology, Hesselgrave and Rahman's Contextualization, Meanings, Methods, and Models, or even Moreau's Contextualization of World Missions, center around theoretical models and often only pay lip service to contextualization as it has taken place in history. There's a great deal to be studied still about the actual process of contextualization in specific churches and local traditions, detailed examinations of the various forces, for example, cultural, social, linguistic, political, economic, etc., that have contributed to their formation. Simply put, many, if not all of us, lack awareness of the complex processes by which the gospel has come to us and the resulting contextual forms of faith and theology that we now possess, an awareness of how we are the products of contextualization, or maybe not. Now, my interest in this subject area is shaped largely by my background as a historical theologian, or even by my own tendency to ask questions like why and how that have led me into this discipline. Such questions, I should note, are typically frowned upon in most traditional Asian contexts. But this is also a very broad generalization, but my colleagues who are missiologists in missiology, by contrast, are typically more interested and invested in the practical and hands-on dimensions of the subject in how to actually do things. Now, my point in highlighting these differences is not to create division. That's not the point at all. But to show that there's actually a greater need for us to come together, bringing our backgrounds and our interests to better highlight the reality of God's work in the world. For Asia specifically, discussions around both contextualization and Asian theology continue to be largely hypothetical and future terms. And yes, the two are interrelated, of course, contextualization and theology. But discussion is still lacking in describing what already is, or what has been, the historical application of contextualizing practices or lack thereof. What we need then is more historians and theologians to come alongside missiologists to contribute to ongoing discussions. We all need more interdisciplinarity. Some examples. In a situation like Singapore, missiologists might ask the question, how do we preach the gospel to the next generation, or to migrant workers, or to certain groups of people? But someone coming from a perspective like mine might ask this: how has a way we have been preaching, and maybe ineffectiveness with particular groups, stem from particular cultural, historical practices, beliefs, and processes? A more forward and practical thinking missiologist might ask, how do we evaluate what proper contextualization looks like in this climate or situation? But a historian might ask, how have the way our churches or traditions been formed as a result of both properly contextual or even syncretistic forces? How do we make sense of or even evaluate the complicated mess that all of us are culturally and theologically? While in-depth historical studies of early mission in the Asian church are still lacking, there's some, but there's a great deal of work to be done, there are some good examples of what this type of scholarship can look like. Typically, scholars have been drawn to places and times where the church grew in unexpected and massive ways. And me being Korean American from a Korean background, I know a little bit more about the Korean church, so these are some examples I share. One example of this is early Korean Christianity, specifically the massive and unexpected revivals that took place in the early 20th century, the first decade and so of the early 20th century, centered around Pyongyang in the north, that led to hundreds of thousands of people becoming Christians in a very short period of time. One of the standards of this is Sung-Duk Ok from UCLA, his monograph, The Making of Korean Christianity, which, despite not being a book about theology, is organized around major theological themes that shape the formation of 20th century Korean Christianity. Some of the chapter titles include gods, saviors, spirits, ancestors, messages, and rituals. A more recent book is KKLU's Understanding Korean Christianity, which I commend for its very clear methodology. Yu argues for the study of what he calls terra culture, the spiritual and social landscape of a particular place that shows how and why the gospel was able to be received there. Now, while there are other Asian examples of this, some of the best known come out of Africa. For example, the work of well-known scholars like Andrew Walls or Lamin Sane or the next generation afterwards. And one of the standards, of course, is Kwame Bediako's Christianity in Africa, the Renewal of a Non-Western Religion, which gives a broad overview of many of the figures and forces and even theological issues that led to the growth of the Christian church in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm aware as well that there are a more recent generation of scholars working on these things in particular contexts. So in addition to answering questions of why and how, studies like these resist the binary in which many of us think: contextualization versus syncretism, success versus failure, culture versus theology. They remind us that what actually exists, what we believe in practice, is a lot more complex and shaped by a greater variety of factors than we often realize. Terms like globalization or hybridization come to mind. There is no such thing as a pure or simple form of Christianity or even contextualization. While redemptive analogies, for example, Don Richardson's work in works like Peace Child and others come to mind, are still helpful to a degree, such approaches can reinforce simplistic understandings of faith and evangelism that leave people ill-equipped to deal with the complex worlds we live in, especially in this world today. Instead, what is needed are more detailed, interdisciplinary, thick studies of churches, whether presently or in history, that examine the complex factors, for example, social, political, economic, racial, linguistic, etc., that have shaped the preaching of the gospel and in the formation of churches. So, contextualization is and will continue to be an essential task of the church. But some questions need to be raised going forward. First, who determines what good contextualization actually is? Is it still Western missionaries and theologians, or is there a more global and communal way of doing evaluation? Second, what are the most pressing examples of Western syncretism, and how then do we resist them? Does inadequate contextualization always result in Western syncretism? Maybe. And third, what are we? Are we the products of contextualization, syncretism, or something else entirely? How can we understand what we are better in all of our complicatedness? Are we contextualizing even today or not? So to wrap things up, given that spiritual formation is intended to be a component of this conference through the Templeton Grant, I want to make one small spiritual point. One underrated aspect of spiritual formation is our knowledge of selves. We need to know ourselves better, both personally and corporately, as I've been arguing. We often think we do, but typically we don't. And I turn to Calvin's famous words in Institutes 1:1, which is the famous introduction. I'll just read it. Our wisdom, insofar as it ought to be deemed true and solid wisdom, consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But as these are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of the two precedes and gives birth to the other. Every person, therefore, on coming to the knowledge of himself, is not only urged to seek God, but is also led, as by the hand, to find him. Might our knowledge of ourselves, by which we come to know God better, not also include deeper knowledge of our own context, how we corporately came to be contextually? Might not better understanding of such issues also equip us to minister to others better, to respond more quickly and urgently to the issues that we are facing, and to preach the gospel more effectively? Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Justin. I don't know whether you want to sit here or just stand.
I guess I'll move over in a second. Yeah.
Okay, all right. No one in the YouTube has offered any questions. So does anyone in the audience, are there any questions that you would like to ask Dr. Justin at this time?
Thank you, Justin. You mentioned, I have written down your note about the danger of syncretism always necessarily being present. Otherwise, it is too easy to slip into a kind of reverse syncretism in Western forms. Can you elaborate even a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so what I mean is that in the perspective of those who are coming into a certain context that's not their own and are, or maybe is their own, and are preaching the gospel in that context, must there also always be the danger of feeling uncomfortable about what might happen here that is beyond what is traditional and typical? So I'm not saying that we're always going to slip into syncretism in that context, but there must be the possibility of openness to culture in a way that might be deemed syncretistic in order for a real pure contextualization to actually take place.
Okay, so, yeah. And I think Darrell Whiteman makes a similar point about this sort of the necessity of the tension as being an essential component to actually leading to real contextualization. And could you comment on our own ambivalence toward that tension? Because it seems to me that our fear and ambivalence toward keeping syncretism far away often prevents anything like this from actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are, whether we know it or not, we are all traditional in some aspect. We are creatures of habit. We know what is safe, and our tendency in whatever context we come from is going to be to do what we have been told, because we know that at the very least, that is the safe way to go. But oftentimes, the safe way is not the best way. Oftentimes, the safe way is not the necessary way, especially when you're coming into a situation that is maybe very foreign or different from what you are used to. So especially when, there's a broader cultural gap that needs to be leapt over, more knowledge of a context that needs to be understood, the people who are coming into it will always find themselves to be a bit more uncomfortable in that situation. But I guess we can say now, in, say, contexts where the church already does exist, there's going to be then, especially in Asia, a stronger resistance to then lean into contextuality or lean into certain cultural ideas and contexts because of a danger of what might happen because we know already that we've done this so far, which then leads maybe the next generation or the current generation of, say, leadership to often be unable to speak truth into a new context. So I'm not just saying this in a overseas, completely foreign missions context. I'm talking about intergenerational issues here as well, where maybe an older generation says, we've been taught this in the church. We've been taught to evangelize in this kind of way. We've taught that theology is like this, and a younger generation is rising up that says, actually, we have these kinds of theological questions. If an older generation is not aware of the context which they're coming from, what they've learned as being contextual in certain ways, and is unable then to address the issues on the ground that they're facing, that's, because of a fear of going beyond what they've learned and becoming uncomfortable in that space, that's an issue then of potentially a reverse syncretistic process maybe, and an inability to then become. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question as well as I could be. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, especially in relation to syncretism. So I've got some interest there. I edited a certain book recently of an African priest or something like that. So he's got a point of whereby he said that the gospel, therefore, is a message that entails that it doesn't have a culture at all. So wherever it's really presented, therefore, it clothes itself within a culture. So he makes an argument that entails, therefore, wherever you can't really deny the aspect of syncretism in the sense that the gospel itself, one or the other, borrows the culture. I want to hear your thoughts on that.
So there's part of it that I didn't hear as clearly because the speakers are pointed this way. So I couldn't hear a little bit of it, but you're asking about like a hypothetical situation in an African context with a
Okay, let me repeat it again. So he makes an argument that the gospel is a message that entails that it doesn't have a culture. So wherever the gospel is presented, it clothes itself within a culture. So the argument that he makes, he said, you can't deny the gospel and syncretism because it always clothes itself and borrows from a culture in order to have a feat to arrive in a culture.
Sure. Okay, I heard a bit better this time. I mean, so this is where, in terms of the syncretism debate, it depends on where you choose to align yourself in how you define it, right? Whether you're a more, pure, like, study of religions person, a bit more of a pure social scientist saying everything is syncretistic in some sense, or we are drawing boundaries a bit more firmly in an evangelical context. And I would say that given that we are, having this conference here with mission in mind, and we're coming from very similar enough faith convictions, we would want to say that, yes, of course, the gospel will always absorb parts of cultures and will take on certain cultural flavors in that context. The church will take on certain cultural flavors and behaviors. At the same time, we have a sense in a broader way of how then do we differentiate between when Christianity begins to lose its, clear, uniqueness, it's the strength of its message versus not. And so in that sense, in various contexts, there's a need for, those who are maybe doing ministry in that context, even say local believers and others, to be able to have a sort of like dialogue, maybe to have a sense of understanding of tradition, but understanding of self within tradition. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question very well. I'm just sort of going off. But yeah, I mean, it's a bit complex of a discernment, I think. I don't know. I mean, yeah. Sorry if I'm not answering your question. Maybe we can talk about this a bit more later. Yeah.
One more? Oh, okay.
Hi, Justin. Thank you for your lecture. A lot of our lectures and discussions tend to be rather theoretical. And it will really help in this case if you would perhaps apply some of the terms that you're using, for example, syncretism, that is necessary, or other terms such as critical or uncritical, and things like the best way may not be the traditional way, or that you seem to imply that the best way will be the new ways. Could you perhaps apply that to the cases in the books that you've read? Perhaps out of the two books, The Making of Christianity in Korea, some case studies which were striking and where you could apply terms like syncretism, uncritical, evaluation, things like dialogue, so that it becomes concretized to us. Otherwise, it's all floating in the ether and kind of still dualistic. Thank you.
Sure. I didn't catch that last part of what you said. After that last point, I didn't catch quite as well.
Could you apply your terms to...
Oh, sorry. Not that, but you mentioned like maybe 3 or so points. Like.
Okay. For example, what is critical or uncritical? What is syncretistic, not syncretistic? Or what do you mean by the best way may not be traditional way?
Okay. So when I'm using the language of critical, uncritical here, I'm referring to how one approaches a certain process. Are you aware of who you are in yourself as well? So if you're approaching a certain context, you are going to be critical regardless of what you think, regardless of what your methodology is. And I think the point was made about moving beyond, say, who was Hebert and contextualization methods. So there's always going to be a sense of criticism in the context, criticalness in the context you're in. But the question is, are we dually critical in the criticism of myself, understanding who I am and what I might be bringing in that context in that same kind of way? So I'm using it in that kind of a sense. The second point was about. Sorry, I already forgot.
Examples. My general question is examples.
Yeah. So yeah, examples, there are many, but I don't know if I'm the best person to share examples given that we have a lot of case studies that are coming up. So
we'll have more.
We'll have more, yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Justin. Okay.
We'll talk more later. Yeah.
Yes, and there'll be more questions about it. Yeah, and I'm going to turn the time actually to a case study. I think you can, or you. Yeah, either way, so it's okay. We haven't quite figured things out yet. We're going to turn to a case study now from Ms. Claire Chong, and she is from the Singapore Center for Global Missions. She has been a missionary in Cambodia for many years, and will be sharing how the Cambodian church is contextualizing.
Good day, good morning here, good day, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Samuel Law, for including me in this lineup of presentations. It is my honor and joy to be here. This morning, I present a case study of a contextualized ritual in Cambodia and discuss its role in spiritual formation. Allow me to begin by sharing my journey with contextualization. When I first began my missions journey in Cambodia in 1998, contextualization meant wearing the Cambodian skirt, draping the Cambodian scarf across my shoulders, side saddling on a motorbike, and of course, having Khmer music and dance for worship. And most importantly, teaching the Bible in Khmer, not forgetting to substitute the English names for the Khmer names, and also incorporating local idioms and stories. But the essence and basic structures of Christian teachings and practices were still fundamentally Anglo-American Christianity. Contextualization for me then was simply decorating Christianity with a few adornments so as to make it appear Asian. Over the past decade, I have been sort of thinking more deeply about it. And, sorry, excuse me. For me, contextualization is now not merely a translation of the gospel into terms that Buddhists can understand better, but a rebirthing of the gospel in the Cambodian Buddhist life world. So the question of, whether the gospel is just a message of Christian theories. In one of the teams that I work with, we are looking at evangelism beyond preaching and intelligent rhetoric, but looking at an evangelism that involves embodying local values and witnessing through culturally appropriated dispositions. Another modality of contextualization is ritual, something as a Protestant I was very adverse to. But ritual matters in the Khmer life world because ritual forms their worldview, it calibrates their moral compass and constructs their identity. Ritual is an indigenous way of knowing and becoming. And this morning, we're going to explore how contextualized Christian rituals can contribute to spiritual formation. So let us first look at a case study. In the Khmer life world, honor is not an idea that we can express in words alone. Honor has to be demonstrated, and it has to be demonstrated in the cultural language of the people. I mean, people need to know that someone is giving honor to another person. And there are several rituals of honor in Cambodia, and one of them is called the Thvai Bong Kum. The Thvai Bong Kum is an act of bowing, which is ceremonially performed before parents, the king, or royal members, monks, and of course, Buddha statues. And when Cambodian people meet a monk on the streets where bowing is not convenient, then they would simply say, I, Thvai Bong Kum, you, venerable. And if we look in the Khmer dictionaries, when we look in the Khmer dictionaries, Thvai Bong Kum simply means greeting, to say hello. And if you ask Cambodian Buddhists, they will all recognize it as a reverential greeting. However, the word Thvai Bong Kum has been unfortunately translated into English to mean worship. And Christians use this word in their songs to express worship to God. And therefore, bowing before or using the word in reference to another person becomes dubious, and it's implicitly tantamounts to idolatry. And this creates profound conflict and cultural dissonance among Cambodian Christians. And good Asian Christians as they are, they will just follow, right, what has been taught to them. However, interviewing some Cambodian pastors, and not all Cambodian pastors will think this way, but some. And some pastors acknowledge that in the Khmer language, according to cultural understanding, the word Thvai Bong Kum is a sign of respect. Not to do so is not about religious impiety, but utter rudeness. Two pastors I spoke with even said that if there were no other Christians around, they would Thvai Bong Kum a monk. A few Cambodian pastors accept the cultural nuance of Thvai Bong Kum and have begun to incorporate it into Christian discipleship and practice. A pastor of an independent church includes a lesson on Thvai Bong Kum in his follow-up material for Christian converts, explaining the difference between worship of God and the cultural meaning of Thvai Bong Kum. Another pastor from a mainstream denominational church in the province, after one Sunday service, organized a workshop in the sanctuary teaching the youths about Thvai Bong Kum. So he got the parents to sit on chairs. Did you see that? Did you see this? Oh, it's supposed to be a video of the young people bowing. Anyway, so he set the parents on chairs, and the youths knelt before their parents and performed the triple bow in traditional way. Another elderly pastor of a small house church organized a parent honoring ceremony. And although the adult children did not perform the triple bow, they knelt before their parents and presented them gifts. And in a Christian school, the teachers redesigned a Christian ceremony of showing honor to parents. The children knelt before their parents, presented gifts, and washed their feet. So as part of my research fieldwork, I also organized Bible discussions on bowing with Cambodian pastors and seminarians. And most participants concluded that the Khmer tradition of Thvai Bongkum could be similar to the Hebrew practice of Shakha in the Old Testament. So there appears to be two uses of Shakha in the Old Testament. Firstly, as an act of worship, people Shakha God, and God commanded his people not to Shakha idols. We are familiar with that. However, Shakha is also used as a cultural form of reverential greeting. We see brother Shakha before brother, tribal leaders Shakha before other tribal leaders, children Shakha before parents. Moses Shakha before Jethro, his father-in-law, who was a Midianite priest. For Cambodian Christians, this is very important because it is very important for them to know that in the Bible, people bow to other people. And by doing this series of Bible studies, in a sense, they renewed their theological interpretive paradigms. And that was necessary. They read Scripture, they began to read Scripture through different eyes. The issue of bowing is just one ritual that the Cambodian church is seeking to redeem. They are looking at many other ritual customs. In 2016, the Evangelical Fellowship of Cambodia, which is the umbrella organization of evangelical churches and organizations in Cambodia, started what they call as Faith and Culture Committee to look at how they can biblically integrate certain aspects of culture with faith. And their goals for the first phase of this project are to redeem the customs of Ka, Ka, Gok. Yeah, it's like a rhyme in Cambodian, which basically refers to birth, marriage, and death. It is very interesting that the Cambodian church have decided to do contextual theologizing through everyday customs. And I believe this model is one that the global church could take note of. Christianity, for many of us, can we say that it grew out of the European Enlightenment tradition? And if I may say, it is a rather heady one, right? As another sister said, it's very theoretical. The modality of doing church mission and contextualization is heavily literacy-based and is driven by textual hermeneutics. And I'm not saying that this is not good. Certainly, it must be interdisciplinary, as Dr. Justin was saying earlier. But when we interface with the people on the ground, should this be the modality of doing church for people who do not primarily do life textually? The Buddhist canon became only available even to monks in 1968. So there is absolutely no history of being scriptural. Anthropologist Stanley Tambiya describes that religion practice in many Southeast Asian contexts is not based on scripturalism. In fact, doctrinal belief is not the primary determinant for religious behavior. And so I think the Cambodian church is showing us something important, a different approach of doing contextualization through a modality of practice in which the theological project revolves around ritual action. So ritual is, in some ways, a Cambodian or an Asian epistemology. Why is ritual so important in the Khmer world? Ritual is important in the Khmer world because ritual constructs the world that people live in. It creates their worldview, it calibrates their moral compass, and constructs identity. And to help us understand what ritual does, I'm going to draw on anthropological studies. There are several anthropological theories on ritual, but this morning I'd like to focus on a body of work associated with 3 French scholars. And they do not focus on the head, they focus on the body. And their conceptions of the body, bodily movements, bodily intelligence, and embodiment, I think can help us to appreciate the pertinent role of ritual in the formation of lived realities, which will also help us to understand the role of ritual in spiritual formation. So let us begin very quickly. Let's begin with Maurice Merleau-Ponty. His work offers a very profound understanding of how intelligent the body is. I suppose you can go back and try this little experiment. So this part you can do it here with me, right? So, just put your hands somewhere where you don't actually can move your fingers, okay? Clasp them, or whatever, and visualize your computer keyboard in your mind. Where is letter W? And what is to the left of it, and what is to the right of it? Let's try another letter. Where is letter B? And what letters are on its left and right? If you go back to your keyboards without looking at the position of these letters, by just placing your hands on the keyboard, try typing the word wonderful body, and it will just come out. It's just a little trivia, right? But this little trivia shows us how amazing the body that God created for us is. You would find that it would be far easier just to do it than to actually think about it. So the fingers will be able to do things that the conscious mind is not, right? So this is just to show us that the body that we have is truly amazing, and it challenges that dualistic Cartesian paradigm that privileges mind over body, thought over action. Moving on to the second French philosopher, Marcel Mauss, he noted that different societies exhibited different types of bodily movements, or what he calls as body techniques. And so the stride of an Englishman is of course different from the French gait. And the way the English people tuck their elbows in at the dining table is different from the way the French would spread them out. And these unassuming, repeatedly body movements have significant physiological, psychological, and sociological impact on its actors. Building on Mauss's theory, Père Bourdieu explains that the bodily practice of life, the things that we do, creates and influences and shapes what he calls as the habitus, right? A system of dispositions, habituated dispositions, or we can simply call it a system of habits, but not just habits of behavior, but also habits of thought, habits of emotion. No, we are all inclined towards certain things. And what is really interesting is how the body will shape and mold our habitus implicitly. That means it occurs beneath the level of conscious awareness. Now let's just compare this with what some Christian authors say. What anthropologists call as the habitus could be comparable to what Dallas Willard calls as the heart, not the organ that pumps blood in our bodies, but the center and seat of spiritual formation. And according to Willard, spiritual formation is the formation and the transformation of the innermost dimension of the human being. And this innermost part is not formed by the intellectual activities alone, but that the body is a vital tool for spiritual growth. Similarly, James K.A. Smith contends that modern Christianity has fallen prey to the intellectualism of modernity. Both Christian worship and Christian pedagogy have underestimated the importance of the body. As a result, we have too often pursued flawed models of discipleship and Christian formation that have focused on convincing the intellect rather than recruiting the imagination. And by imagination, Smith explains it as something very similar to the habitus. He calls the imagination as that which shapes our identity and governs our orientation to the world. And the formation of this imagination happens through embodied ritual as well. So what does this all mean? Oh, sorry, I'm going to skip that. Whether a person bows to God and hides their face in prayer and prays quietly, or whether a person lifts his arms and head in prayer as if to look at God eye to eye and utter loud prayers. According to the theories of embodiment, these ritual actions, these body movements will shape our cosmology, our view of God. It will influence the way we think and feel, and it will habituate certain dispositions and condition our social behavior. And this is what Lee Sevier, a Cambodian author of the book on ritual bowing. Remember, ritual bowing Thai Bongkum is not worship, right, in the Cambodian language. He says that ritual bowing cultivates profound respect for each other. And ritual bowing is a silent teacher. It tacitly teaches people to know one's position and place in society without uttering anything. An abbot remarks that a person who knows how to bow is a person in harmony with himself. He is secure, not afraid to be humble and to esteem another person. But what is really important to note is that respect for another or other ritually cultivated core values like gentleness or loving kindness, these values are not only esteemed by the Cambodian society as moral values, they are more than moral values. They are markers of Khmer identity. And so, when foreigners, such as Christian missionaries, unwittingly supplant indigenous customs with a set of practices alien to the local ways of life, it creates significant changes in people's habitus. Of course, any changes or transformation toward Christ-likeness is worthy. However, changes that alters wholesome Khmer moral ideals, such as respect, gentleness, loving kindness, equanimity, and promote instead behavior that valorizes Western ideals of egalitarianism, boldness, straightforwardness, confidence. Not that these are bad, but because they are not considered as Khmer moral ideals, these characteristics will be perceived negatively and as subverting Khmer culture. And if Christianity is associated more with these characteristics, then Christianity will inevitably be deemed as a foreign religion. From colonial history, so these are non-Christians writing about Christians during the colonial period, we know that Christianity was rejected in Buddhist Southeast Asia not because people rejected Christ, but because foreigner Christians exhibited moral vibes that were antithetical to the Buddhist vision of a noble and virtuous life. Christianity as a religion was evaluated by the behavior of Christians, which were perceived as abrasive and antagonistic, and was deemed as an inferior religion compared to Buddhism. And thus, doing spiritual formation and nurturing Christian character in culturally acceptable ways is important for Christian witness. I mean, this cultivation can come from didactic teaching, but also through embodied practices of contextualized rituals. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the floor? Okay.
Thank you, Claire. Clear, good presentation, enjoyed it. The question is, how can we show as Christians that we're different? Okay, and that's the struggle with contextualization, isn't it? To be in but not off. To be like them but not to be so like them that we are not different, then they can't distinguish you Christian, you Buddhist, the same. So in this particular ritual, how do you think we can Christianize it so that, like this one is Christian, that one is Buddhist?
Thank you, Kim Keok, Dr. Kwa Kim Keok. Dr. Kwa was one of the first lecturers who introduced me to contextualization, so thank you. Okay, maybe I just share that from a personal point, right? So, done the research, theoretically I know that Thwai Bongkum is showing respect, but I find it very difficult. I mean, honestly, I find it difficult, right? I mean, I can do it. So what I do is I modify it. And I've actually had conversations with Cambodian Buddhists, including Cambodian Buddhist monks. And I share with them, I'm a Christian. Of course, they know I'm a Christian. And I want to show my respect to you, but I'm afraid that I could be mistaken. And so in my conversation with them, amongst those whom I know, I have developed a different way of bowing to them. So I don't do the triple bow, but I would bow and then just hold it a little longer, just to, I guess it is my need to let myself and also to let people around me know that I'm trying to show respect, but yet not, do it. Yeah. So, but it's easier for a foreigner. I think it's more difficult for a local, for a Cambodian. And I really do not know how to answer that question. I think the Cambodians themselves will need to come together as a hermeneutical community and sort of decide for themselves how they want to respond to this.
Thank you. So I'm going to follow up with Kim Keok's question because I think Brandon in the YouTube chat asked a very similar question. He basically asked, how can we discern between contextualizing to help a cultural group understand the message versus making it more palpable? In other words, is contextualization trying to improve understanding or make it more attractive? And I think what you're sharing is the fact that it actually contextualization enables Cambodian Christians to maintain their identity, but within a Christian, flipping it in a Christian worldview. Is that correct, or?
Yes. So I definitely thought that, contextualization is just to make it look Asian so that, people won't continue to accuse Christianity as a foreign religion, but I think it goes far deeper than that. I think the whole embodying it through ritual, many Cambodian pastors would often say that discipleship is one of the main problems in Cambodian Christianity, right? And no matter how long, no matter how hard Cambodian pastors try to organize Bible studies, right? And, but somehow, they feel that the Cambodian Christians are not sort of, to their own vision, to our vision of what a good Christian should be. And I think it's not because of it's not the fault of the Cambodian people. I think it's the fault of the methods that we use. So if we're going to use a very heady theoretical approach, the people are not going to absorb it. Yeah. Okay. So ritual actually forms and transforms the worldview.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. That was very nice. I think what Bishop Wayong and our brother was saying is that much of contextualization links to translation, which link to understanding, getting people to understand. What I'm hearing from you and what Kamaya Patters did was not understanding, not interpretation, but participation. And thank you for you bring up discipleship. And I think much of our discipleship has to do with understanding again, but not participation in the life of Christ. So I'm just thinking maybe you can help us a bit. What would be a good way to shift from engaging contextualization as understanding, move from that box and shift to, okay, let's engage contextualization as participation. Yeah, there might be, maybe I'm just assuming, but I could feel like there's a gap there that we need to cross. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks, Ray. As you were saying that, and I was just thinking the French philosophy, right? So for them, it's like, it's not just the mind that understands, it's the body that understands. That the body actually is, I know for some of us it may feel really weird, but if you think about it, little babies, infant babies, right? Their cognitive faculties have not been developed yet, but when they touch something, wherever they move, through their bodies and through their senses, they are actually understanding their environment. And that is how they actually form their world. And this ability actually continues throughout our lives, but we just don't think about it because, we privilege this over that. And what, this approach of discipleship through embodied practices, right, gives value to mental, intellectual understanding through embodied practices. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, but specific examples, I suppose, we'll need to take it further.
Yes, we'll go a little bit further. Makes us realize that we are influenced by German and English theologians and scholars, but we totally forget the French. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a very quick 5-minute break, and we're going to come back and we'll invite Bishop Hua-Young and Justin and Claire together, and then we'll continue the Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to go through the questions on the YouTube and then provide opportunity for the audience. But let's take a very quick 5-minute break, and we'll come back. Okay, thank you.
You want us to go ahead?
Which is our English? Because I don't know.
Phenomenology.
Phenomenology.
Yes.
Phenomenology is interesting stuff, though. I think Smith is a guy who's making popular in evangelicalism. It's more of an embodied reality.
Okay, one more minute and we'll come back. I have the same experience. With Justin. Okay. It's okay. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with a Q&A. And I'm just going to, I think there's some questions that have been brought up, but I'm going to start off with Bishop Hua Young first. And I think I'll ask Steve Pardue's question. How should missiologists or theologians respond when they propose thoughtful contextual readings and practices, but then local Christians still seem to prefer Western forms of worship or life? In other words, I think we're currently in a period where the Western theologians and missiologists, they're already shifting in a more humble approach, but yet within the Asian context, there's still, I don't want to say rigidity, but I think still using a Western framework. How would you, and this also ties to another question, is how would you help church leaders understand that it's okay to contextualize? I think that's the challenge that is being faced.
I think that's not an easy question, because if you try to tell people that they must do things different, they'll just laugh at you. I mean, you try to tell that to one of the mega church pastors in Singapore, say that your worship is just like the Americans. How many of them will listen to you? None, literally none. You know? So I think what you have to simply do is you just carry on. I think it will take 1 or 2 generations for the change to take place. But every opportunity I tell people, I say, look, think about doing things in a different way. For example, what I'm going to say is not a criticism on SBC or anybody like that. I say, for example, you think of architecture. If you ask me how I like to build my seminary, I would like to build it like the Lutheran seminary in Hong Kong. Beautiful Chinese architecture. How many of you have seen that? None of you have seen it. Or those of you have seen it, you nod your head, you see. The thing that struck me wonderfully was when I came down the library and then walked down the stairs, there was this beautiful circular Chinese window, right? And framed right there was Hong Kong Harbor. I said, wow, that's beauty. And that's taken Christianity and made it culturally sensitive. It was beautifully done, you know. So I tell people things like that. So I think people I think you just have to keep going at it. So I think we just have to do our theology. I mean, I'm really impressed with what I'm hearing from Claire. I'm waiting for her PhD thesis to be published. Have you finished your exam yet? You better get it done quickly. It's that sort of work that will help people to rethink their Christian faith and get them to think through what is important. So I think you cannot push it, because you push it, nobody's going to listen to you. But I think if you slowly teach it, I think people will change. I think that I grew up in a time when the Western paradigm was dominant, but young people today now are growing up with, for example, the Chinese paradigm is very dominant now, the Islamic paradigm is very dominant, India is very strong. So they will begin to think about, oh, it's not just American architecture or American films or American music that's important, but Chinese music, Indian music, or even increasingly among the Muslims in my country, the Arabic music. So how do they think? So that change will have to take place over a couple of generations. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And do note, Bishop Hua Young, if you actually look at the window in the back, it's very Chinese, especially this one there with the tree.
I see that the Lutheran World Seminary, that was utterly beautiful.
Okay, thank you. Maybe for Justin, I should ask Claire, is that when you started to carry out research, did you face any resistance?
Yes. So immediately I can think of two. I was having this conversation with a young lady pastor, Cambodian pastor, and she was saying, "Oh, why can't we lift our hands and sing? I mean, I like it, And after all, David was right. David was like, being foolish in the way he worshipped God." And yes, so they will also know how to quote Bible verses to counter the invitation to contextualize. And then, when the pastors were doing the wedding contextualization, there were some pastors who were saying, no, we have to wear white. The bride has to wear white because that is Christian. Right? So they have been very, very ingrained, as we are. We have been very ingrained in seeing and doing things in particular ways. And I think this is where the role of foreign missions can continue to contribute. If, like how we brought in the Western kind of Christianity, so our role continues to be that as well, and we need to slowly encourage and empower them to do it, I think.
And I think this also answers the question, I think, Bishop Weil, it had to deal with urban context, whether or not contextualization would look differently. And I think it sort of has been answered, is that if the culture is already Western, we just let it go and maybe see what happens. But in areas where the culture is still non-Western, then we should allow the freedom for the local or indigenous groups to be able to contextualize. One of the things that I also want to, maybe I'll make the statement too, is that Justin had actually given a THM lecture 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I heard from one of the faculty members they said that SPC was going liberal, or they disagreed in the sense that we were going. But I think what we want to help people understand is that we still, I think, greatly appreciate Western missionaries and their sacrifices. And if this was not done, very few of us would be believers. But I think, because of the transition that we're moving into the majority world, there does need to be a shift. And what has happened is, like, if you think about 1st century to 4th century, it went from a Jewish church to a Roman church, then a Roman church to a Northern European, a German church, and then an Anglican church, and an American church. There is a transition. And right now, there are what I would say African flavors, where Konosi Mulatto will share next week. There'll be Southeast Asian flavors and so forth. It's still one church, but there are different ways by which we look. And I think Ray was mentioning that the Jewish rabbis talk about diamond with facets. All of these are orthodox. It's just practiced in a different way. And I don't know whether Justin wants to, I think there is a question for you that is somewhat related to this. That is up there. So you have 4 questions. I don't know whether you want to go ahead and answer those questions from the YouTube. And if you can help the audience to just read the question and then just answer.
Sure. There's a few questions from 2 people about contextualization in current context. One about how we can help people change to kind of realize that what they're doing is contextual. That's actually a very difficult thing to do, because if you're sort of entrenched in a certain way, you're not exposed to other people in perspective. You'll think my way is the way, and oftentimes people in certain Christian contexts who are stuck in those worlds are not able to see what the world looks like outside of that. For example, I have a younger brother. He's married to a girl who's from conservative Midwestern German Lutheranism, like very, very tight circles, and that's the world they live in. They are worshiping they're out of that context, they're worshiping in a Presbyterian church in a different state, and some of her family members think that she's basically lost. She's apostate because she's left the conservative Lutheran fold. How will you teach these people that actually Christianity is broader than the tradition that you're raised in? You have to show them what's outside of their context. And I think that in our context, one of the easiest ways to do it is you look at, bad example, the American church. Being an American, I see a lot of strange things going on. You're saying, these are the people who believe the same thing as you, but you see some of the ways that their beliefs might be misguided in certain ways or shaped by certain cultural factors, for better or for worse in certain ways. So sometimes we need a bit of that exposure. So contexts like this are a bit better in that regard. And there's another question about contextualization. Yes, our Bible reading is always going to be shaped by our own context. In biblical studies, you're trying, especially in an evangelical context, to have a more objective reading as possible, but none of our readings are perfectly objective. We need to be as into the original context as we can, but aware of our limitations. So for example, even if you think that so-and-so scholar from America, UK, or whatever has the best reading, one thing that majority of world scholars have identified again and again is that how do they deal with the supernatural world? How do they deal with these kinds of issues in their reading of these texts, given that these kinds of issues permeate Old and New Testament? If you come from a very, post-Enlightenment, non-supernatural world, you're not going to catch where those types of things appear in addition to other issues. And so honor-shame is one of those major issues that we will be getting into. But has the previous tradition, the former tradition, neglected these issues because of a certain way of seeing the world? Well, we need more perspectives, as was just mentioned, that are all orthodox to be able to highlight the broader facet instead of assuming that one person's scholarship can highlight the fullness of who God is. And another question that I'll answer comes from Steve Pardue. In light of your knowledge of the early church, can you describe occasions in which early Christians pursued especially good or especially poor contextual theological moves? Can these help us today? The answer is it's complicated, right? Because when we go back to, say, the early church and the sort of what is typically called the Hellenization hypothesis, Adolf von Harnack and all that stuff, where Christianity in some sense was robbed of its purity when it encountered Hellenism, the answer is actually it's very complicated because there's good things and bad things that came about in this cultural encounter. On the one hand, we were able to see certain aspects of the Christian faith that wouldn't have been as clearly seen had not Hellenistic concepts, philosophy, terms been brought in. There wouldn't have been the language to discuss ideas of person and essence and nature in other contexts. There wouldn't have been an articulation of Trinity in a certain way or Christ in a certain way, and things would have been a bit clearer, maybe a bit less orthodox in certain ways. But at the same time, things like theological anthropology, dualism that was mentioned that is characteristic of this is one of those examples of maybe negative things I think that people do know. But another example that just comes to mind is, again, I mentioned this conference that was just taking place. Syriac Christianity is a third branch of Christianity outside of the Latin West and the Greek East that's more Semitic in character. So those living in this part of the world typically spoke a language called Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic. So they're Semitic thinking people, and the way they're doing theology, for example, in Ephraim the Syrian, is in a very poetic way. His theology is by poetry, and the way that they think about the world is in less dualistic terms. And as Syriac Christianity spreads and grows, what you see actually is that it's encountering other faiths along the way, and what you get in, say, Chinese context, even within the 7th, 8th centuries, is actually appropriation of Buddhist titles to describe Christ in ways that people now would say, isn't that syncretistic? But if you have no other terms to talk about Christ, but you call him like the greatest Buddha, I'm butchering it, in that context, that actually makes the most sense. So how else will you describe him, given that this is the language and concepts that people are using? So is that good contextualization? Is that syncretism? I think it's somewhere in the middle where we have to sort of learn how to evaluate that better or to deal with those kinds of complex issues better. But there are both examples of good and bad in nearly any culture and context that we can look at. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? And we'll bring it.
Thank you for quoting Dean Fleming. Dean Fleming used to be a missionary in the Philippines, so I know him. And in Dean Fleming's trying to explain to us what contextualization is being familiar with the culture and being familiar with your culture, right?
I'm going to actually ask Ray to come forward so that the audience can see your, what do you call it? Come back, your somatic expression.
Okay,
so come forward so we can see what you're doing.
What I'm doing. Okay, so Dean Fleming gave us an explanation of what could be contextualization is, right? And I'm trained as a communications major. And my training was always to ask who is speaking, where he is speaking from, and to whom. And the assumption in Dean Fleming's, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just trying to situate the definition, is that somebody from here doing contextualization from there. In Claire's case, if the Khmer pastors from Cambodia do the contextualization amongst themselves, the definition will no longer hold because they are insider within the culture and they do not need to cross that bridge that is part of Dean Fleming's definition. So maybe my question for, I don't know who I would like to respond is, how do you see, this contextualization has been here for 74. People fought about it, Bishop Wang was saying, people resisting it. But we need to look to the future as Bishop Wang is encouraging us. How do you see contextualization moving forward if it shifts to being owned by the people and not being defined to them by people from the outside? Even the questions of, is it syncretistic? Who knows? They will be the one to say, oh yeah, I think this is a bit dangerous. But people from the outside, we can just guess.
Okay, thank you. So how will it be done if, I think the question is, how can we understand contextualization if it moves to the local people, right? So I don't know whether anyone wants to answer because I can answer. I have a short answer. Does anyone want to try? Let me go ahead and I'll share this and then we can go a little bit, have more time. If you notice, the group of theologians that we have, scholars are here, are actually from around the world. And we intentionally, and this is why we're very thankful for the Templeton Grant, is because of the fact we can fly people from Canada and from Africa, from the United States, as well as from Southeast Asia, because we tried to get someone from Latin America, but there actually is no direct flight from Latin America and South America to Singapore. It would have cost for one person 6,000 Sing. So, and he wanted to bring his wife, which put it out of line. So you might ask the question is, why is it that we're bringing all these people from around the world? The reason is because, and this is partially me, and I could be totally wrong, but I think if we go back to the early church councils, even when we go to Acts chapter 15, that the apostles and the elders were called, right, for the first council of Jerusalem, which meant that it was not only the apostles, but it was also the elders from the various churches. And I can't remember who had mentioned this, but if you go later on to the councils, Ephesus, and I can't remember the other ones, but it was a group of multicultural. So we want contextualization to occur locally, right, in a particular culture. But if we understand how the church has addressed the issue of syncretism, it has always been different viewpoints, right? So in other words, you need to have not only what we call insider and emic understanding, you also have to have an etic external to be able to validate whether or not something that is contextualized is orthodox. And one of the things that we're going to be doing, we have a presentation in the morning, but in the afternoon, all these 10 people are going to come together. We're going to put them in a room, and hopefully they will have good dialogue and not fight. But it is the fact that we'll be discussing various things, and then we have Chris Flanders, who has served in Thailand, but also comes from a North American perspective. Konosi Malato from Botswana, who's studying in South Africa. He will provide an African perspective to look at some of the issues. We have Nari Santos, we have you from the Philippines, from Canada, that also will be part of the discussion. And then we have the local Singaporeans, Kim Kyok Kwa, Claire, and Justin and I are sort of in between because we're Asian Americans. Bishop Hua Young, who has seen. Also, we have gender as well as what do you call it? Generations. So we're trying to look at all these different facets to try to understand. Okay, if we take a case study of honor shame as a case study, how do all the EMIC insiders and the outsiders, do we come to agreement? If I think there is agreement, then we can probably say it's orthodox. I don't know whether that answers your question. This is an experiment, so I don't know whether, okay,
yeah,
Justin.
If I can make just one quick comment. I think that it's quite a well-known thing that where the gospel has come to places and great revival and evangelism and church growth has taken place, it's typically always been like insider spread, right? That oftentimes, in many cases, it's maybe foreign missionaries come in and then the locals will be the one to do the spreading of the work. In cases where locals are allowed to do church on their own and do things, things will always look different and uncomfortable for those outside looking in because there will be certain turns and unfamiliarities that seem dangerous. And even one example of this that I think all of us would be aware of is something like the like Azusa Street revival in the first decade of the 20th century. It's a very interesting example of within a Christian context, a certain revival, evangelism kind of a thing, but how was it viewed by the majority of people at the time who are used to a more traditional cessationist type culture? Very negatively, right? You can go back and find clippings from the Los Angeles Times in that era that are denouncing all of the blasphemous and even scandalous things that are taking place in that context. But if we look back on it now, what do we say from this perspective? We've passed the charismatic chaos movement, and now we're saying, oh, actually, that's a indigenous church formation. So it's always going to be a bit more uncomfortable from the outsider perspective, the mainstream or whatever that looks like.
A quick comment. Yeah, and precisely because of what he said, I think the insider must have the confidence to take the initiative. They can listen to the outsider's comments, but the ultimate decision has to be taken by the insider. And I think that's where the modern mission movement had made a big mistake, because they were trying to tell the insider how to frame the theology. If you read Roland Allen's work on missions, you find that that's precisely what he says. We must let the insider make the final decision. I just want to make a comment.
Thank you very much. So this brings us to 12 o'clock, and just to let everyone know is that the PowerPoints will be distributed, and the recordings will be available until Friday. But then it will go through some editing, and then it will be released later on. So the participant, those of you who have registered, you will have access to the recordings through Friday, and then after some editing, we'll release it to the general public, so you can always pass the links. A little bit looking forward. Maybe I'll explain this, that you guys are welcome to come to lunch. We have invited all the guests, not only the ones that presented today, but also those who are presenting on Tuesday and Wednesday. Please do join us for lunch. It will be in the Oasis and the conference room. It's $4, so you can use Pay Now, but you can get the meals and then join and have a time to continue the discussion. Next week, for tomorrow, we are going to be looking at honor shame through a biblical perspective. So we have Dr. Jerry Huang, who will zoom in from Chicago, and also Dr. Neri Santos will be sharing as well. And then on Wednesday, we'll have 4 case studies on honor shame. So we're continuing this understanding of contextualization, but trying to understand it using honor shame as a case study. At this time, we'd like to ask our principal, Dr. Clement Cha, to come. We're so thankful he's here because he just came back from the US. He's only here for 3 days. He's leaving tomorrow for East Malaysia. So he is here in this very brief time to give us a contextualized prayer. So, so we can ask Dr. Clement to, can also pray there. Shall we all rise?
Yes. Shall we rise and come together? We are thankful to all of you and also our keynote speakers, the panelists, and all our guests here. Welcome to SBC. It's a family that welcome you. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we give thanks for this wonderful time. We can gather here to think through and ponder upon these very important issues in theological world, is to contextualize what we believe in our own context. May God help. In the Helix Research Center, we gather here seeking your guidance. As your word reminds us, the old has gone, the new is here. As we delve into the mysteries of human nature and also the gospel truth, may God help us to work together and reflect the transformative power of your grace. Grant us wisdom and humility to use our discoveries for the greater good, and with honor of God and for God as our guiding light. May God help us and protect us from the shadows of sins and also the selfishness of human nature. Help us navigate the ethical complexities of our research and always choosing what uplifts and heals. May our efforts promote healing, justice, and human flourishing. In our pursuit, let us be defined by love, compassion, and integrity as new creations in Christ. We thank you for the privilege of coming together, contribute our ideas and thinking to these very important subjects to make a world that honors you better than before. And with all this, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you. Please be seated.
And I totally forgot Chris, who will actually give us Chris Flanders is going to, at the beginning tomorrow, give us the summary of honor shame from his perspective. So my apologies for forgetting Chris there, but he will be the first speaker for tomorrow. So we look forward to those of you online and those of you on site for another exciting discussion tomorrow. Thank you. So those of you who are here, you are welcome to join. If you go out and you go straight to that side, that's where the canteen is, and you can use Pay Now or pay in cash, $4. Thank you.